I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 14, Consumer Protection. The case study in this chapter is all about Volkswagen and their clean diesel initiative from 2015. So maybe some of you remember that they had a whole campaign about how they have turned diesel into a clean energy. Typically, diesel gas is very dirty and not good for the environment, but they said that they had found a way to make cars powerful, because using diesel can be more powerful for the driver, but also making it good for the environment. In the end, Volkswagen was caught by trying to trick the testing and the emissions regulations. And anytime a Volkswagen car went up on rollers, the software would see that, and the emissions would be dropped by quite a bit. In reality, it was over 40% more, 40 times the nitrogen oxide that was allowed. And this nitrogen oxide obviously causes smog and health problems. So there were so many lawsuits, anger. The CEO resigned, obviously, all because this clean energy, this was defeating devices, the software, to cheat on these emission tests. So we're going to get into this chapter here, talking about who protects the consumer. If you bought a Volkswagen car, were you protected? How are you protected? Let's go ahead and get started. The first slide here are our learning objectives. The first one is talking about knowing the 5 major rights of consumers, right? So as a car, if you purchased a car, what are your rights? The second bullet point here is analyzing the reasons for consumer advocacy and the methods consumer organizations use to advance their interests. The third one is assessing the ways in which government regulatory agencies protect consumers and what kinds of products are most likely to be regulated. So we'll talk a lot about government regulation here, because there are a lot of agencies in the U.S. and abroad that get involved in making sure that the consumers are protected when they make a purchase. The fourth bullet point here is determining how consumer privacy online can best be protected. Again, a topic that comes up again and again in this course because it is such a hot topic in today's day and age. What is data privacy? What does that mean? Number 5, examining how the courts protect consumers and efforts by businesses to change product liability laws. What are those liability laws? And number 6, evaluating how socially responsible corporations can proactively respond to consumer needs. So in your Aim to Flourish projects, you'll be getting to know a lot of these corporate social responsibility organizations. Let's move into the rights of consumers. These rights of consumers are defined by the consumers. So over the last couple of decades, these are what the consumers have come to the table and said these are what they believe are their individual rights. The first one is the right to be informed, protection against fraudulent, deceitful, or grossly misleading information, advertising, and labeling, and to be given the facts to make an informed purchasing decision. So when you go to buy a car, a Volkswagen car, that you have all the correct information that you need to make that decision. The right to safety. This is all about protection against the marketing of goods that are hazardous to health or life. So again, right, Volkswagen case, there was no right to safety, right? The smog and emissions was 40 times bigger than what they actually thought it was as a consumer. The right to choose, assurance of access to a variety of different products and services at competitive prices. The right to be heard, so assurance that consumer interests will receive full and sympathetic consideration in government policy and the courts. So if you have an issue, that you as a consumer can be heard in the courts. And then the right to privacy. This is assurance that information disclosed in a commercial transaction or when using social media or searching online is not shared with others. So again, this topic comes up again and again in our course, the right to privacy. Let's talk about the 4 methods now of protecting consumers, otherwise known as the 4 methods of protecting consumer rights. So consumerism, this is where consumers act to protect their own interests. The government regulation, again, this is a big one in this chapter. The government regulates product safety and protects consumer privacy. Law in the courts, people can sue when they're injured by a product. And the last one, industry self-regulation. This is where businesses and industries protect their customers through product recalls, quality programs, and voluntary codes. We'll talk a lot about product recalls in this chapter as well, right? Nestle has gone above and beyond, making sure that if there are any issues with any of their products, they're the first to recall their products before the courts or consumers or any regulation needs to come in to make them do those things. Let's talk about the self-advocacy for consumer interests. Here, I like to start this slide by talking about the Latin phrase caveat emptor, right? This means let the buyer beware. So as long as business has existed, right, consumers have tried to protect their interests when they go to the marketplace to buy goods and services, right? That they know that when you make a purchase, that they are that it's up to them to take responsibility for their purchase, but at the same time, they want to make sure that they're protecting their interest in the marketplace. So what is consumerism, otherwise known as the consumer movement? These are collective efforts by consumers in many countries to safeguard their own rights in many nations. And so the four major U.S. advocacy organizations that help consumers are the Consumer Federation of America, the National Consumers League, the Public Interest Research Group, and the American Association for Retired People. So those are four big groups that help individuals when it comes to purchasing items. How does the government now protect consumers? The role of government is protecting consumers is extensive in the United States as well as in many nations, right? Consumer protection laws are designed to safeguard the 5 rights of consumers. So those 5 rights we talked about in the previous slides. So the goals of consumer laws here. The first one, to provide consumers with better information when making purchases. Right? This comes up time and time again. The one that I personally love because I was so involved was in 2008 when Countrywide, they were a company that handed out mortgages. They didn't tell people fully about their loans and about their responsibilities. They were handing out loans like lollipops, right? I've had many friends that took loans from them, but didn't really understand what a loan was and how it worked, and that you actually had to pay it back within a certain time. And if the value of your property dropped, it didn't matter because you have a loan on a specific amount of money, right? And so Countrywide got into a lot of trouble because they were not, as this first bullet point says, they were not providing information to their consumers when making purchases about their loans. Another one that comes up is that the FTC enforces self-advertising. We're going to talk about this on slide 10, where Volkswagen came in and said they had some clean diesel. No such thing as clean diesel. And then the last example, just for this first bullet point, because it's just so important, is that there are health warnings on cigarettes or that tobacco can hamper your health, and also there are on all of our products now nutritional information, right? The number of calories, sugars, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all ways that we can provide consumers with better information when you're making your purchase. Let's go into the second one. This is to protect consumers against possible hazards. So these are side effects, potentially. The case in the textbook when they talk about Wen hair care, right, that they were selling their shampoo and mousse and different things, but they had like 21,000 people who were saying that people were losing their hair, that the product wasn't working, that they had really, really bad side effects from their hair care. So the consumer laws are out there to help protect consumers against products like these. Another example is that the government has stopped toy makers from including a chemical called phthalates that helps make plastics more pliable. And so when those phthalates are ingested by children, then they're health hazards to those. So the U.S. government and government organizations come in and say that that toys cannot include these potential chemicals. All right, so then the third one here is to promote competitive pricing. We don't want any monopolies, so to change the price artificially. We want to promote customer choice, right? Also giving consumers opportunity to choose among many different toys or products that they'd like to buy. And then the last one is to protect their privacy. Let's hop into the next slide. Here we're talking about the major consumer protection agencies. Again, agencies that you might be familiar with, and if you're not, you will be familiar with after graduation. There are two slides here about the major protection agency. The first one is the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. This talks about competitive pricing, deceptive trade practices, packaging and labeling, consumer credit disclosure and reporting, online privacy, again. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration. I won't go through their major responsibilities for all these, but just be familiar with these organizations. The Consumer Product Safety Commission. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, otherwise known as the Transportation Department, right, talking all about car and safety standards. Department of Justice, talking about fair competition, consumer civil rights. National Transportation Safety Board, again, airline safety, really important. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, that is fairness and transparency in consumer financial products and services. That's where Countryline, that's who they were up against. And then the last one here, the Department of Agriculture. So that talks about meat and poultry safety. Let's go ahead and talk about deceptive advertising. This is a really great one, especially for people who are marketing majors, that this refers to manufacturers making false or misleading claims about their own product or a competitor's product, withholding relevant information, or creating unreasonable expectations. This is illegal, right, in most countries, and the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, enforces the laws prohibiting deceptive advertising, and the U.S. Justice Department enforces related laws prohibiting false claims. We also want to talk about here that talk about data aggregators because that goes back to consumer privacy in the digital age. Sorry, I'm already getting ahead of myself. Let's hop into the next slide. Let me first give you an introduction to consumer privacy. It's a rapidly evolving information technologies in the 21st century, so this is leading to consumer privacy issues. New technologies enabled businesses to collect and use vast amounts of personal data about their customers, and there's some dangers, right? That information might rarely be used fraudulently, and that unwarranted violation into personal privacy. So we talk about this again, as I mentioned again and again in this course, but this takes the next couple of slides take us through what exactly is privacy. And I was going to talk about data aggregators here. So data aggregators are people who purchase and combine this information to then send to the retailers. So some of you who study business analytics here at LMU, you might go to work for a data aggregator, right? Your business, your work is to actually work with this data and then to sell it, right? And that in 2017, Facebook took in $40 billion in revenue from the data that they collected on all of us as Facebook users. They then took that data and then they sell it or they use it actually in creating advertisements for advertisers on their website. And so there's a lot of money in this privacy and this data industry. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. This is behavioral advertising. This is advertising that is targeted to particular customers based on their observed online behavior intended to be tailored to a user's interest and preferences. So this is exciting, right? So that if you own a business and you are selling kites, you might want to target parents who have children, right? Because those are probably the most common people who sail kites. So there are some benefits, right? The buyer is more likely to receive messages that are relevant. So I'm a parent. I might be interested in buying a kite. I might get some nice advertisements about the latest kite technology. That's awesome. I'm excited to receive that. And the seller is more likely to reach prospective customers. The seller can now find me because they know from Facebook that I have a child and that I am in my 40s and that I am interested in potentially maybe buying a kite. But there are a lot of risks that go along with this as well, right? The consumer might be denied opportunities such as credit based on their online profiles. So if I was looking for a mortgage and there was some information out there about me, about my about my credit, I might not get the mortgage. That would be information that I didn't necessarily release. And there might be information collected by behavioral advertisers that may not be kept private and secure. And so maybe I don't want a lot of people out there knowing that I have a child, or a lot of people out there knowing that I'm 46 years old, etc. And how do these aggregators and information, how do they get this information? So the book outlines a handful of vocabulary words that I thought was really relevant to bring up here. Cookies, right? So my information is tracked by cookies. I go to a website about kites, or I go to a website about toys often. So they're able to now identify that I potentially have a child or that I'm interested in buying toys or kites. Web beacons, right? These are embedded in emails to retrieve information, right? This happened to me today, right? I wrote an email to my dad telling him that there's some cookies that are being delivered to his house today for his birthday. A couple minutes later, I go to search the web for kites, something unrelated. I see an advertisement about the same cookies that I had just bought for my dad for his birthday. Those are web beacons. Salesforce.com, if you ever go to work for Salesforce.com, they're heavily involved in web beacons, a super interesting and entertaining field. Deep packet inspection. These are third-party access where they can go in and analyze the information. So deep packets, that's another word that is familiar probably to business analyst majors. So going into analyzing the data. GPS, which you all know from your phones and from your GPS devices, this tracks people on their phones and their locations. So again, there's a lot of information out there as to where, as a parent, I go. I'm going to the playground, I'm going to the park, I'm going to the school, etc. I'm going to which supermarkets I'm going to. And then there's also a term out there called Internet of Things. These are all about smart thermostats and home alarm systems. So better for worse, these devices and items can track lots of things that are going on in the home. Those Alexa devices, right, for better for worse, are tracking information on us. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide, consumer protection in the digital age. So what does consumer protection mean? This is the last slide of part 1. Consumer protection is all about this dilemma, how to protect consumer protection while fostering internet commerce, right? There are 3 proposed solutions. Consumer self-help. This is where internet users should use technologies that enable them to protect their own privacy. So we should be able to create our own settings. We should be able to opt out if we don't want to have our data collected. There's also industry self-regulation. This is where the internet-related businesses advocate being allowed to regulate themselves. So Facebook is saying now that they are starting to regulate themselves, that they're open to government regulation, right, as we spoke about in this course, but they are working to have in-house regulators to make sure that this information is not being sold to the wrong people, that they're not doing anything malicious with their data, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge debate, right, as to whether or not Facebook is accurate when they're regulating themselves when it comes to our data and who gets their hands on this data, right? And is this really realistic? Because at the end of the day, Facebook makes billions, $40 billion, right, in use of this data, right? So from selling data to the advertisers or allowing advertisers to target their messages, right? They're making money, so are they truly going to be regulating themselves to the standard that the consumer wants them to be? And then the last bullet point here is private legislation. This is favoring new government regulations protecting consumer privacy online. And the EU, as we've seen in this course, is much more active than the United States when it comes to having government regulation on these organizations. So if you use Facebook abroad, in Europe, it looks just a little bit different because the EU has really clamped down on on the information that Facebook can collect on EU residents. So that ends part 1